This is Floss Weekly. I'm Doc Searls, and I'll be joined by Shawn Powers this week when we talk to Christoph Zimmermann of Redis Labs. That's coming up next. Floss Weekly is brought to you from LastPass Studios. Securing every access point in your company doesn't have to be a challenge. LastPass unifies access and authentication to make securing your employees simple and secure, even when they are working remotely. Check out lastpass.com/twit to learn more.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is Floss Weekly, episode 595, recorded Wednesday, September 9th, 2020, Redis Redux. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Privacy.com. Privacy lets you make purchases online using virtual cards instead of real ones, protecting your identity and bank information on the internet. New customers get $5 to spend on their first purchase. Go to privacy.com/floss to sign up now. Hi, everybody. I'm Doc Searls. Welcome to Floss Weekly, and welcome also my co-host this week, the great Shawn Powers, who is, there he is, with his fool gun for killing off fools there behind him. So fill us in on where you are. What's your time zone this morning?
I'm in northern Michigan. The time zone is the Eastern time zone, and daylight savings time. I kind of feel like I'm having a test here. As far as the flamethrower getting rid of whatever, I don't know what you said, dumb people? I don't know, but I have almost killed myself with it. So I don't know what that, what that says about me. Anyway, yeah, just here in Michigan, we have rain. I think you have fires. And then I did see in Colorado, it's snowing. So welcome to 2020.
Yeah. This is, we have the just that way about 20 miles is the Bobcat Fire, actually, and it's about 18 miles across, and it's spreading through the wilderness and heading towards civilization from two directions. But we're overcast, so we can't see it right now. And when it's clear, it's pretty dramatic. But I'm fine.
Do you smell smoke? I mean, does it smell like a big giant
I haven't smelled
campfire?
Smoke. There is ash fall, though. We do see kind of a snowy ash falling down from time to time. You know,
it's charming and depressing both.
Not as bad as when I got the cremains of part of a deer falling on my roof in Santa Barbara. There was a clunk near me, and there was this rib, a hot burned rib falling from the sky. Yeah, those things happen.
How does that happen?
Welcome to California. Yeah,
is that like Santa flying over and things go bad for the comet?
Yeah, the wind goes up very strongly. So in these big fires, and then they carry the embers and they drop. So that's how the fire spreads. Anyway, so we have Christoph Zimmermann of Redis Labs here with us this morning. Are you hip to Redis? I would hope.
So yes, I've actually used Redis, and I wish I would have used it earlier. I'll wait for
if you got cool things to say, we'll save it for the show.
Yeah, my history of Redis is. It's a little depressing for me, but it's a funny anecdote. So,
well, let's get going, and we'll start with our sponsor. This episode of Floss Weekly is brought to you by Privacy.com. You don't use the same password everywhere, so why use the same card number when you shop online? Privacy.com gives you a brand new virtual Visa or MasterCard number for every purchase you make online. Download their browser extension from the Chrome Web Store or their Android iOS app and link your virtual cards to your U.S. checking account or debit card. What this does is let you take control of your finances. You set a spending limit. You can control your subscriptions and reoccurring payments. You never worry about forgetting to cancel your subscriptions or free trials ever again. You make sure you are never accidentally billed twice or upgraded without your consent. With their card sharing feature, you can easily and safely send someone a privacy card straight from your dashboard in just a few clicks. That's for the desktop only at this point. No more copying, pasting, or screenshots. Your recipient won't need a privacy account to access the shared card. Just click on the share button. When viewing a card, enter an email address to share to, and privacy will handle the rest. For security, you can feel safe about making purchases anywhere online. Privacy is PCI-DSS compliant and held to the same security standards as your bank. Sensitive information is secured using military-grade encryption. That means your information is encrypted using split-key encryption with partial keys held by separate employees. No single person can access the sensitive information on the server because it requires multiple keys to decrypt. Privacy does not sell your data. Your information is safe with them. With their free personal plan, create up to 12 cards a month. That's secure, merchant locked, and single use. Or choose between their paid versions, Pro and Teams, where you receive 1% cash back and additional security features. Recently, Privacy also launched their card issuing API, which is built specifically for developers and small business owners who are looking to create cards at scale. If these plans sound like they could be a good fit for you, check out Privacy today. Head to privacy.com/floss and sign up for an account. As a special treat for our viewers, new customers will automatically get $5 to spend on their first purchase for a limited time only. Yes, that's free money. Go to privacy.com/floss and sign up now. Okay, so welcome to Floss Weekly, and especially Chris Zimmermann with Redis Labs. Hey there, Chris. I think we're on two sides of the earth.
Yes. Thanks for having me.
Guten Abend. Yeah, you're in Frankfurt.
Frankfurt, Germany,
I'm in California. Ich habe 3 Jahre in Deutsch im Hochschule gelesen. However, I gave those back when I was done. So that's as far as I can go.
So we cannot do the episode in German then, can we? Doesn't matter anyway.
No, we can't.
I took German in high school, so I can ask you if you know where there's a friendly dog, and that might be about the extent of my my ability. So I might have to duck out of this one.
Let's keep to English then.
I was in order to graduate from college, I needed to pass an examination in a language. I had to read a page of German, which is the only language I'd ever studied, and then translate it. And the teacher said afterwards, "I'm passing you, but only because I've never met anybody who could pronounce a language better while understanding it less." So that was
nice.
that. So welcome aboard. Now, Shawn, you have experience with Redis, right?
I do. So here's my Redis story. I learned PHP because I was managing an entire data center full of, they're Bitcoin miners, to be honest. But I learned the PHP language so that I could interact with their API, and I didn't know how to work databases at all. I didn't know how to do anything, and I learned PHP from the word go. And I learned that I had to have a way to store data. And obviously, and be able to retrieve it. And so I thought, well, I will take all of this data structure that is in JSON format in PHP, and I'll dump it to a text file, and I'll store that in the Linux server in like dev shim is the RAM drive. And I'll just store it there, and it'll be there, and then I will retrieve it when I need to. And I did that for months. And then I was telling somebody about the program, and they said, "Why don't you just use Redis?" And I said, "Because I don't know what Redis is." And so then I looked, and look at that. There's a far more efficient, easier way I could store key data. It was amazing. I felt silly, but I have to admit, my whole store a text file in the RAM drive, it was pretty efficient, and it worked really well. So while Redis is definitely better, my hack job was effective. So.
So Chris, fill us in on where Redis is at these days.
But before I do this, actually, full marks to you, Shawn, but you had to be root for this, right? So that's another exposure in terms of security. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to write to dev shim.
I don't know if that's true. I think you can write to dev shim as a user. I'm going to log in and test it right now.
I do. Okay, Redis, where it comes from. Simple, well, actually quite a funny story. About 10 years ago, the first commit was on 21st of March 2010. A guy called Salvatore Sanfilippo was looking for a very performance database for a web reporting project that he had in mind initially. So he checked out Postgres, he checked out Memcached and all the rest of them, but no open source component, no open source database was able to measure up to his expectations. So he decided to sit down and do his own version of a very performant in-memory database. Hence, Redis was born with the idea of, well, storing data and retrieving data from main memory rather than on disk. And over the years, Redis has evolved into a full-blown primary database. If you take a look at the requirements for quite a few projects on GitHub, you'll see Redis as one of the requirements for storing and retrieving data. And the usage ranges from antivirus programs to mail servers to quite a few other applications that require some sort of fast persistence in the background.
And I just got to notice that several of my apps crashed out of nowhere. So forgive me for that. And so how long? So when did this start? And forgive me, I'm just sort of looking for the time frame on this.
No worries. Well, if your apps crashed, you probably didn't get the 10 years part. Redis just passed 10 years in March of this year. So the first official commit was on 21st of March 2010. And yeah, so Redis has been existing for the last 10 years.
So can I ask a question?
If that makes sense.
Yes, please go for it. That's I was waiting for Shawn to come up. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. I'm curious. What was the motivation? What made you decide? You know what? There's a ton of databases. What is it that made Redis happen? Was it an experience like mine? Were you storing text files in DevShim?
No. Quite the opposite, actually. Salvatore was looking, as the project founder, was looking for a very performant database architecture. So although he took a look at MySQL and how to optimize MySQL and Postgres and all the rest of the traditional SQL-based databases, he couldn't come up with a tweaked architecture, if you will, that would able to allow him to get the throughput requirements in terms of speed and latency that he was looking for. He checked out Memcached, but Memcached had some other drawbacks, and he intentionally sat down then and wrote, which is now Redis, starting off as a kind of modest key value store, but with a couple of kind of differences between Redis and Memcached. So, for example, I think Memcached had this later on, but Redis more or less right from the start was able to attach a time to live to a particular key, and then the server would automatically garbage collect the values that had reached their time to live, timestamp. So the idea was to come up with a very performant caching solution that developed then into a full-blown database architecture over the last 10 years, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating. I want to point out really quick. Can I switch here? I don't know if you can see this, but this is in my DevShim folder. I really did test, and sure enough, I can store stuff as a user. So
interesting.
I should package this idea up and sell it. No, not just kidding.
Please do, yes.
But so that's interesting because actually you stole one of my next questions. It was about does Redis have to have any sort of additional tweaking like Memcached for MySQL? It seems like it's trying to make, I don't know, by design, if Redis is that fast, it doesn't have to have those tweaks. But are there things that people are doing or that Redis has done to make it even more performant? Or is that, since it was designed with that in mind, is that kind of a moot point?
No, it's a very interesting question, Shawn. And the idea was, as I said, to write a very compact and very efficient database implementation, as in NoSQL in-memory data store. I came across Redis. Let me tell you my Redis story. Actually, I came across Redis in 2012 when I was looking for, it's funny enough, for a very performant PHP opcode cache. Bear in mind, 2012, Zend hadn't done their very efficient PHP 5 implementation with regards to the opcode cache that you get with modern versions of PHP now these days. But in 2012, that didn't exist. So I came across Redis, and that has been working on my ARM v5, which is a 32-bit architecture with a single core powering quite a few PHP FPMs, as in the application server that is able to execute PHP workloads ever since. And I've stuck to this code base because at the time, and that is still the case now, Redis is very, very compact. You're looking at, I think with version 6, you're looking at about 100,000 lines of code or something like this, if not less. And I run this still on this V5 with 512 megabytes of main memory and a single core running at 1.7 gigahertz or something like this. So I'm looking for space efficiency in terms of small footprint and modest RAM requirements. And that's exactly basically how I came across Redis, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is tiny. In fact, yeah, it's fast. And so it's funny that you say that you run it on such a small machine, because it just highlights how bad my own personal PHP code is. Because I had to, when I was reaching out to this whole data center, there's like 1,500 devices that I had to reach out to, and I had to learn how to fork PHP and all that stuff, which nobody really cares about. But I had to get this massive server in order to get PHP to fork that many processes every minute and come back. I hadn't even thought about it at the time, but Redis wasn't even something that registered on memory and CPU usage, and that's probably a more of a significant thing than I realized at the time. So, I mean, yeah, efficiency, that's pretty great.
You see the uptake, actually, if you take a look at how many distributions include standard Redis now as part of their standard repos. All of the major ones like Ubuntu, like Debian, like Arch. By the way, I'm an Arch package maintainer, full disclosure. CentOS, Manjaro, and all the rest of them all have Redis as part of the standard repositories, meaning you can install it right from the command line. You can get it on Mac. You can get it even without WSL, I think. You can get it on Windows. All that requires is a POSIX-compliant operating system. I regularly pull down the Redis code base and I compile it on a Mac running Catalina. And that compiles with the Xcode C-lang, so you compile it out of the box. You don't have to do any tweaking. The code base is a very compact code base written in C, no C++, no Java, and no other strange esoteric languages. So rather straight to the bone, close to the metal, bare bone C.
Cool. So, okay. So, Redis is the program that has been running from the Redis Labs as a company. I'm curious though. You said Redis was designed with efficiency and a small footprint in mind. How does that go within the world of security? Right. I mean, we mentioned earlier like root access, not root access, but I do remember when I started using Redis, I was surprised that I was just able to connect to the service and store and retrieve data. It wasn't like with MySQL where I had to create a user with permissions and then I had to grant certain permissions to that user and where they could connect from and that sort of thing. So are there security concerns with Redis? And I kind of set you up there. Obviously, it's been designed well, but how does security work in the world of Redis?
You see me smiling. Initially, that wasn't one of the goals of the project to develop an ultra-secure database. So the standard default installation in the days was still basically you open up port 6379 But from early days, you could protect your database with a password that was then stored as part of the configuration of the server. But, and this is pretty important, you could already then secure the server installation by simply not permitting a TCP-based port to accept commands, but rather just using a local Unix domain socket, meaning that only local processes were able to talk to the server. That hasn't changed. That is still the case. Plus, with version 6 of the server, security was a major aim with that version, because now, and Redis is pretty unique in that area with regards to, I've yet to see a performant NoSQL database that implements ACLs on a per key basis. So you're not only able to protect databases with regards to certain users, but you are actually able to tell which user can access what keys in what fashion. So it's pretty close to what modern SQL-based databases have to offer, if not more.
Are you still able to, and I'm not using the most recent version of Redis, so are you still able to just log in and use the database without setting up permissions and users and stuff in advance, or has that evolved to the point where that's a necessity before you just start accessing the server?
There's a default setting basically now. If you're listening to a IP address which is not localhost, there's actually a server setting that basically mandates the setting of a password. So these days, where you can simply roam the internet looking for open Redis instances, at least with version 6, these are gone. Or sorry, I think that's even with version 5 these days.
Cool.
So I'm interested in unpacking a bit more about the difference between and the relationship between Redis Labs and Redis itself, where one ends and the other begins, how the business of Redis Labs works, and that kind of thing. Because almost every open source project that has a commercial sponsor has a different relationship between them and the developers and all that. So could fill us in a bit more on that. That'd be cool.
No,
yeah, thanks.
No problem. Redis Labs was set up in 2012 with the aim of providing managed Redis instances on clouds, in cloud environments. So the idea was to provide a database as a service, as in that case, a NoSQL database as a service company. But over the years, Redis Labs has also put out Kubernetes-based distributions of Redis. There's a premium product called Redis Enterprise that comes with service and all the rest of it, but at its very core, it's still open source Redis. The idea was to essentially to provide, as I said, database as a service. And although Redis Labs sponsors the project, Salvatore, until he resigned as a BDFL, as a benevolent dictator for life, earlier this year, he basically owned the roadmap. Although he was technically employed by Redis Labs, he was pretty independent with regards to architecture choices, roadmap decisions, and so forth. What is pretty important, and I think there was a lot of confusion recently over the last couple of years, Redis as such has always been available under under 3-clause BSD license, and that won't change. That is still the case, and that always will be the case. So anybody who wants to check out the source code, wants to use it in whatever environment that they see fit, simply clone the source code on GitHub and off you go.
That's great. So as it's grown over the years, it seems like suddenly everything, especially at the enterprise level, is more containerized than ever. And I'm wondering how in the increasingly containerized world Redis fits versus other database approaches.
It's straightforward. It's on the Docker Hub. So you simply actually say Docker run Redis. It pulls down the source code from the open source GitHub repo, precompiled of course, and then it's instantiates a container on your machine based on this particular open source image. As a matter of fact, it's one of the most pulled down databases, NoSQL databases, open source NoSQL database of all times.
So it's interesting that because it's so quick and so small, do you find that most Docker instances are let me give an example for MySQL. When I'm using MySQL in a Docker environment, I use Docker everywhere. I'm a big Docker fan. I'll have a MySQL container, and then I have a MySQL network that all the other containers connect to that one central MySQL server, and the different databases are on there. Because Redis is small and efficient and everything, do you find that people do the same thing where there's a centralized Redis database that different containers connect to, or because it's small, does each app tend to have its own Redis, so to speak, whether it's internal to a container? And I realize that's an end user's choice, but which do you see happening more often? Is it efficient enough that it just gets wrapped in? I mean, we don't have a centralized LS program, right? That all the containers share. So is it that efficient where it becomes just part of every other container, or does it stand alone?
I mean, it really depends on the use case, right? I've seen all of these different use cases. So, where people are obsessed with the Saga pattern, for example, with regards to microservices, particularly implementations of microservices, they would use their own Redis instance. But I've seen also Redis instances handling quite a few gigabytes or terabytes of data that are highly available, clustered, scalable, running as a centralized service. Basically containerized, of course, and then the app stacks surrounding this huge clustered instance basically make use of this particular highly available and scalable instance. It's so there's no real kind of hard and fast answer to this. It really depends on the use case.
That makes sense. For what it's worth, I usually wrap it in with all my stuff. Not that anybody was asking. I have not created a centralized Redis database for all of my random projects. Possibly because I don't trust myself. I figure I'm going to mess one project up with another. So,
I mean, in interesting observation, there are quite a few. I mean, sorry, full disclosure. I'm a community manager, but also I help with pre-sales in the DACH region for Redis Labs. And quite a few of my customers, basically, who start out with open source, have their own managed in-house service, providing services around a managed, fully clustered instance of open source, then acting as an internal, if you will, internal service provider, providing that service to lines of business using or which need a performant NoSQL database, in-memory NoSQL database. So you have all these kind of different varieties of scalable and highly available architectures within the customer base, depending on if they're a tier 1, tier 2 customer, as in the equivalent of a what I'm looking for, Fortune 500 company, as a massive entity with entities with a significant number of lines of business, all in search of performant databases, powering their mobile apps, powering their consumer portals, and all the rest of them. And quite a number of other companies basically avail of service providers, often offering a managed service instance as a commercial offering, like Redis Labs does. So you have the whole variety, depending on your particular use case you can choose from.
Very cool.
So let's talk about ports next. Because we have a question coming in here, which is why port 6379?
Funny story. When Salvatore basically was trawling the port space, there was this Italian actress called Alessa Merz, I think. And if you dial MERZE on an American telephone, you actually come up with 6379. She's still around. I think she's a model. She appears on TV regularly. She's a bit of a looker, all right. So I can fully see Salvatore's point basically in choosing this port number, and of course it was still free at the time when he registered it, and this is basically how 6379 came into existence. It's a bit of an internet kind of free and open source lore, if you will, I suppose.
All right, now I'm curious. Is there an app that's using 5309 for Jenny 8675309? Kind of want to Google that now.
Why not?
That's what I should write a program right now and take that port if it's not taken.
Of course, you can change that port in the server configuration if you choose to do so.
But now I don't want to. Now
I'm looking for a phone so I can like do the numbers on it. What's the one for mute? I don't know.
So if this wasn't like an actual show, I would tell you I'm so super proud of my phone number because my phone number spells something really unique, but I don't want to say it online and get like 1,000 spammy text messages. So just have to trust me. It's really awesome.
Yeah, so, my phone number ends in 9666. Everybody tells me that, okay, there's the mark of the devil in your phone number, but I've had it for 20 years. So the devil hasn't got me yet.
It got dark, and then I see fire in the background there with your image, Doc. I don't
it still looks okay, Doc, so no worries there.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, so this is another maybe softball question, but so where does Redis go from here, right? I mean, you have super fast, performant, easy to port, easy to install, easy to use. Where can it go? What does the roadmap look like?
That's a very interesting question, and thanks for asking this. I reckon the future, to a major extent, lies within something called the module ecosystem. About 4 years ago, the concept of modules entered the code base, i.e. the idea was, although Redis is already pretty rich when it comes down to data types offered. You have sets, you have sorted sets, you have lists, you have bitmaps, you even have geospatial data types as part of the native Redis server functionality. Some people thought it might be a good idea to have a document database or to have a graph database or to have a full text search index on top of Redis, giving you the kind of native performance of native Redis. So the idea was born to come up with modules, simple C, C++, and sometimes with Redis JSON 2, even Rust-based extensions that are compiled into a shared object and then loaded upon server startup, giving you an application-specific native data type. Let's use Redis Graph as an example. Redis Graph implements an in-memory graph database in functionality comparable to the likes of Neo4j and friends. It's almost fully OpenSAFA compliant, meaning you can use OpenSAFA as a query language, but in contrast to more traditional graph databases, you have one significant advantage. You have in-memory data storage and retrieval, meaning where other graph databases still kind of do their multi-hop queries, Redis Graph running on top of Redis already has the result set shipped to your client side. This would be, and you see this actually on GitHub and friends. People simply take this module SDK and do their own thing in terms of developing their modules, deploying their modules. Redis Labs as such has put out quite a few modules on the source code you find on GitHub, but community-wise, this is really where it's at. Because the SDK is fully documented, it's live. It's been live for the last 4 years. There's even a Rust crate that maps the C-based SDK to Rust. So when Redis Labs decided to re-implement Redis JSON, i.e. the document extension of Redis, they didn't do it in C again, but rather chose Rust. As a matter of fact, there's a FOSDEM talk of this year, when FOSDEM was kind of still physical in place in Brussels, where I basically take a look at what has changed between between C and Rust, and also basically give an outline of what you're paying with regards to the perceived performance penalty when using Rust rather than C. And as it turns out, the performance overhead, given the benefits that Rust brings with it, are quite minor, let's put it this way. You're looking at a markup of less than 10%, depending on the particular use case.
Okay, so admittedly, with different languages, you are starting to talk over my head. I understand what you're saying, but I don't have any real world experience to compare with. But that actually brings a question to mind. So the idea of a modular way to integrate different data types into Redis, correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding would be that if you can do this at a modular level with Redis itself, you get the drastic performance increase as opposed to just encoding whatever data you want into a format that Redis would natively support. Is that kind of the point where you don't have to use your software CPU time to encode and decode something in real time if Redis will support that natively? Is that the advantage that you gain doing that?
That's exactly it. I mean, if you take a look at Redis JSON, if Redis JSON wasn't around, of course you could store your JSON documents in a string or in a hash map. It goes without saying, but you would have to do the querying based on JS query or some other query language yourself on the client side. So essentially, you would store the documents in Redis, then you would retrieve the documents. Then query the documents on the client side, and then extract the bits and pieces that you're interested in. So that's at least another 2 additional round trips to the server and back. Given the fact that the module is able to do the querying for you, you simply ship the request to the server side. The Redis JSON module does understand JS query and simply gives you back the bits that you're interested in. Meaning, rather than having all these additional round trips, you execute this functionality on the server side, giving you the performance that you're looking for. If that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. It actually affirmed. It turns out I did understand what you're talking about. That was really more affirming that I was on board with you. How many different types of modules are? Yeah. Oh, go ahead,
Shawn. Before we go any further, I bet you a crate of the finest German beer that I can think of, you're using Rust on a daily basis.
You've seen the car that I drive, so that.
No, if you're using Firefox, if you're using Tor, you're using at least parts of a code base you're using a code base of which at least parts are implemented in Rust. Servers implemented in Rust and Tor. More and more of the Tor implementation is moving towards Rust. And these are just 2 kind of examples of modern projects, if you will, that are seriously taking a look at this programming language that has been around for the last 10 years. But I didn't want to try. I just want to kind of set the context here.
Yeah, no, that's cool. How many of these different types of modules are currently being developed that you know of? I mean, there's probably some that you aren't even aware of, but mainstream, so to speak, modules. Are there a bunch of them? Are there a handful of them? Is there a big community that's developing them? Is it fairly new? Tell me more about the world of modules.
Absolutely. Glad you asked that question. Redis Labs at least does 6 modules, 7 actually with gears, out of the box. And these are just the modules done by Redis Labs. When I took a look about a year ago, I found at least 10 or 15 on GitHub doing a very simple search. But I reckon since then, the module ecosystem has simply exploded. And it would surprise me that you would only see a fraction on GitHub where people simply decided to publish them for the benefit of others, like the usual open source approach, where others basically would decide, okay, my module is so proprietary, is so special, little point in putting it on GitHub, or simply where the sponsor, like the employer or somebody else, says, sorry, my time, your salary, my code. So I reckon that quite a few modules wouldn't even see the light of the day in terms of being published on GitHub. So as with any other major open source project, what a company does with the modules is basically up to them.
Okay, so modules that some are officially supported by Redis. I'm curious, the Redis Labs, you said that a lot of the main business model there is providing cloud-based services, and you can correct me if I'm wrong there, but if somebody wants to use modules that aren't, I don't want to say supported, but modules that aren't managed by Redis Labs or managed by the Redis project, is that something that people are on their own then, or do the modules somehow, can you integrate custom modules and still use the services that you're providing commercially?
This is a very interesting question, of course. the majority, I reckon, at least the customers that I know of actually, use open source as part of their development stack, but they're using an enterprise version, and they would then maybe use any custom developed modules only in development as a kind of a prototype or something like this. Whereas in the enterprise version, they would stick to the provided modules, of course. But then I know quite a few companies too that simply use the open source version, provide a managed service themselves, and use whatever code base they see fit. Of course, there is a process at Redis Labs where you could actually vet a module, meaning it undergoes quality assurance within the company, making sure that any code we deploy for you in production, for example, as part of a cloud service, is fully vetted, and then will support your code base, yes. But then you're talking about process alignments, you're talking about change window alignments and all the rest of it. So it really depends on the use case. If the use case justifies this, more often than not, I reckon it wouldn't.
That's cool. But the ones that do eventually bubble up to being fully supported obviously could start somewhere. So that's cool. Course, I was just curious how that works with the enterprise version and the open source version.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, Chris, what your favorite use cases or ones that are most interesting or disturbing or whatever. But I'm interested in hearing more about the actual use cases that people might encounter in the world.
I'm tempted to say PHP opcode caching, but this is just my take on the situation because this is how I came up with it. Funny enough, actually, I use Redis for any own cloud, for any Nextcloud instance that I deploy, and which are still a significant PHP opcode PHP code bases. I would use Redis as the primary opcode cache. But apart from that, as I said, you'll find Redis in mails. I think the craziest use case it wasn't Clam AV, but it was some other virus scanner that had Redis as a backend for storage implemented, or kind of as a choice of storage backend, probably for performance. If you take a look at your ordinary Clam AV run, which is a very popular virus scanner based on Linux, you notice that sometimes because of the architecture, the performance could be better. So I reckon the particular author of that particular virus scanner had this kind of, I wouldn't say negative experience in mind, but said something along the lines that, okay, the more performant a central backend component is, the more performant my overall project will be. And this is the reason why I offer the Redis as a choice of backend, never mind recommending this for production usage. I would reckon that this is kind of the funkiest use case that I've seen. Redis use that.
What are some of the biggest use cases? I mean, I don't mean this to sound insulting, but I'm not a big developer, so I've used Redis on multiple cases. But for me, it's always been smaller projects, right, where I needed to have that place to store data, retrieve data really quickly, and that sort of thing with minimal setup time because I'm lazy. But what are some of the larger projects that have really taken advantage of Redis? And I mean, obviously, I'm not asking you to tip your hand about like who are your enterprise clients, but are there big projects that are that you're really happy to see take advantage of Redis?
I'm more than happy to name companies. I mean, one of the biggest stock exchanges in Europe use Redis as a reporting tool to ensure regulatory compliance in MiFID II context. MiFID II is a European thing, where the European Union said now, with regards to a particular choice of investment, you have to document basically a certain set of metadata. And the biggest German stock exchange actually uses Redis for this particular purpose. So for the marketplaces where billions of trades flow through every single day, the ones that are subject to this compliance requirements, basically, the metadata is extracted and stored in one huge Redis instance that is then used to do the regulatory compliance reporting. Closer to your heart, I suppose, I think it's the biggest DIY chain in the US, starting with the H and starting with the D, uses Redis to adaptively manage their supply chain. The idea is and this is basically, you can see this on our homepage, you can see this in a webinar that is out on YouTube. If a storm front hits Tampa, the history shows that you can sell X% more shovels. So the idea is not to send the trucks to Tampa when the storm front has already hit, but rather do it in advance so that you can sell more shovels at the time when the customers arrive at the store. So they constantly monitor stock levels, as in inventory levels, buying behavior, customer influx in stores, but also weather front and other data, aggregate these terabytes of data, and thus not only monitor, but also control their supply chain. And the Redis instance is quite large, as you can imagine, for them doing this, because they're not only doing this for shovels in Tampa, they're doing this for each and every product line in their 1,500 plus branches, I think, in the US.
Okay, so that actually brings me to another question that I hadn't even considered until you started talking about the scope of things. How does Redis Labs deal with privacy? And let me just preface that by saying, folks like myself and folks in the open source community, folks in the security community, often dislike our data being stored by somebody else, right? Like if I upload documents to Google Drive, I'm uncomfortable with Google having my documents there unencrypted in their stuff. So how is data privacy handled? Is that the responsibility of the end user who is utilizing your services, or is there some inherent privacy based into the instances? How does that work?
It's a very relevant and interesting question, I suppose. It boils down to, again, your particular use case. You can have Redis as a software, it goes without saying. You can install this on your premise with an enterprise or free version, and then it's under your full control. So whatever security measures you have put in place, basically, these also apply to Redis, goes without saying. When it comes down to clouds or even hybrid deployments, where portions of the workload are on-prem and the other portion of the workload is actually in a cloud, we normally rely on the security mechanisms as provided by the cloud provider. So encrypted instances, the enterprise version, but also to some extent the open source version, for example, supports encryption between the client and the server side right out of the box. And then, of course, with version 6 of the open source code base, you get full ACL control. On an enterprise level, this is then complemented by a full role-based access control, thus allowing you a very fine-grained access to your data, compliant with the usual requirements. But feel free to take a look at the open source implementation of these access control lists, because they are on GitHub. Okay,
which probably, I'm not saying this is the case, but it would make sense that the idea of a cloud environment may have inspired a lot of those ACL creations in the software itself. So that makes perfect sense.
I mean, feel free, as I said, and this is what quite a few customers do before they even go near the open source version. Basically, they vet the source code. They audit the source code. If it checks out, and I've yet to see a case where it doesn't, they simply go for it. Especially in security and compliance-related environments. The German stock exchange wouldn't be using Redis if that wasn't compliant.
Sure.
So I'm wondering, I mean, when I look at your use cases, I think maybe you're talking about Home Depot earlier, but you've got FedEx. I'm just looking at all the names scrolling across the bottom of your main webpage, and also your use cases are, caching, real-time inventory, fast data ingest. That, and you're in financial, retail, and healthcare too. You're kind of at the forefront of seeing what the world is doing right now, and I'm wondering if there's anything you could say about that. I mean, 2020 is a year when the world changed almost utterly with the pandemic. That's a global thing, but with a lot of local effects. And I'm wondering if at least in a secondary way, as a supplier, you're seeing some changes in the world you're willing to talk about, or just some intelligence you've got about what's happening out there as the world moves into a much more real-time thing.
No, that's actually a very interesting observation, because you're spot on. Especially since kind of March, February timeframe, you have seen a lot of shift from the physical world to online. And you'll see this actually in cloud deployments, in customer requests, and all the rest of it. More and more people are looking for this instant experience when it comes down to real time. If you're talking mobile apps, people are just not game to wait for 2 or 3 seconds before they see the result on the screen, but rather want the kind of immediate result on their screen right now, especially in mobile. That means that the onus is actually on the back end, because if you take a look at the typical journey, you hit a web page. That web page is powered by a web server. That web server in turn talks to an application server. That in turn talks to a middleware layer that normally would include something like a database. So if you are looking at your typical, round trip of being less than a second, depending on the network speed, you have about a millisecond to answer your database query. And you want to do this in a highly available fashion, because the last thing you need is actually, especially when a customer wants to buy something in terms of conversion rates, your database failing. And that's exactly where more and more people are taking a look at technologies like Redis, like real-time in-memory databases that are able to scale and power your tech stack so that you get this instant experience for your customers.
So there's one use case that you may have no involvement with at all, or you might have some, but it's one that I'm close with, which is what's happening in real time with advertising. That when you mentioned you go to a web page, and a lot of what happens when you go to a commercial web page right now is that there are all these calls that go out to, and not just to Google and Amazon and Adobe, which are sort of the big players in that, but to all kinds of other third parties, and there's a lot of fraud in there. It's a four-dimensional shell game of almost real-time stuff that may slow your web page loading by an awful lot while these trackers are loading in. I'm wondering if you pay attention to that, or if you have any clients there of anything interesting to report, because it's a pretty crazy area.
No, as a matter of fact, actually, quite a few fraud detection companies use our technology to ensure that this fraud doesn't happen. There's an Israeli company, the name escapes it at the moment. It's not biotech, it's something else. And of course, unfortunately, I cannot name the name right now, but one of the major global credit bureaus is developing their next generation tech stack with Redis. So that open source code base actually helps to prevent fraud.
I was tempted just to let the audio go really long, just to show how important it is to be responsive. But I didn't know that everybody would get the joke. So, I started today talking about my introduction to Redis when I was writing code to manage an entire data center full of Bitcoin miners. So that brings me to one of our questions we try to ask everybody. What are your thoughts on blockchain? And I'll just leave it wide open so that you can address that in however way you want. But blockchain.
It's an interesting question. I reckon that starts the trilogy of standard questions at the end of the show, I suppose.
You're familiar with the show. Very good.
Oh, yeah. I've been listening to FLOSS Weekly for the last almost 10 years. Make that 8.
Wow.
I've been on FLOSS Weekly at least 4 times.
Oh, and really? I knew one other time. I didn't know about 4. Oh, my gosh.
No,
it's I've been on
long time
as you know,
of the show.
Randall was here forever, but I'm still new. So is Shawn, for that matter.
long time fan of the show. An active promoter, I might add. I mean, don't get me wrong. Okay. Blockchain, very, very interesting. I mean, theoretically, if you have enough main memory, you could probably store the whole blockchain in main memory if you choose to do so. Because if you're looking at how long it takes to download, what is it these days, about 200 gigabytes or something like this, of the whole distributed ledger of simply just blockchain. And blockchain, of course, is not the only cryptocurrency out there. So that might be your answer to any performance problems or challenges you might have. But more realistically, Redis is just a technology. So it goes without saying that you can use it whatever your use case is.
So since you know the show, you also know
I do.
We're coming down toward the end of our hour on the half hour here. So one of the trilogy, as you say, is what haven't we asked? And then you've got about 3 minutes to answer that one. So before we get to the next.
So this is not the time to do a shameless plug, or should we keep that till later?
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
No, of course. As maybe one or two listeners know, I do have my own podcast. It's called Linux In-Laws that I host with a friend of mine. So if you're looking for a mixture of humor and open source subjects, check out linuxinlaws.eu. Just simply head over to the website. And as a matter of fact, we did have Randall on recently talking about the olden days of FLOSS Weekly. So that would be kind of an interesting show to check out for the people who are just new to this FLOSS Weekly format, since Doc Searls took over. What else? I think with regards to Redis, we have covered pretty much of the ground that is out there. I'm not sure that I can think of a question with regards to Redis that hasn't been kind of touched.
Well, that's great. And we'll get into the show notes here, your podcast as well. And I'm glad to hear that you had Randall on. He was one of our heroes here. Next question, I guess our final question, what are your favorite text editor and scripting language?
You'll be glad to hear that for a text editor, actually I use an operating system called Emacs. Because Emacs is just much more than just an editor, right? So you can email, you can kind of do anything in Emacs. No, jokes aside, Emacs I've been using for the last... I compiled my first version of Emacs in '87. So that makes it 33 years, something like this. And wow. I reckon, and Randall was already kind of giving out about this. Yes, I have used Perl in the past, but these days I'm afraid it's more like Python. Whenever I have to program, for example, much of the tech stack behind Linux In-Laws is written in Python. Like much of the automation behind the submission and behind the website automation is written in Python. And that's normally what I use when I have to take a look at an existing problem and then let's see what has been written already out there in terms of the module ecosystem of Python. And then more often than not, and Rust, by the way, is getting there too. More often than not, writing a program in Python basically means taking a look at what's out there and then simply writing or contributing the glue code that is still missing. So Python would be the scripting language, or it would be the scripting language, long name for me, scripting language of choice here. Yeah,
it's for another show. But when you mentioned the role of Rust with Tor. The Tor browser, I'm relying more and more on the Tor browser. The Tor browser is very cool. So that's for another show. Well, you've hit the half hour very tightly, and I really appreciate it. This has been a great show. Thanks a lot for being on with us, Chris.
Thanks for having me. It's been.
Oop, my face froze. I don't know. Are we still on here?
I can hear you and see you, Doc.
We're still on. Okay, great. Okay, great. So Shawn, that went really well, I thought, and I really appreciate that you know as much as you do, and that you're actually a hacker with Redis.
That's a really kind lie for you to say, Doc.
It'll work as one, but it's not really a lie.
No, and in fact, I was happy to co-host because I mean I really did have a Redis experience, so to speak, that changed the way that I think about programming, and that sounds pretty deep, but no, it's been an awesome program for me to use, so I was happy to talk about it. Doc, this is outside of the scope of the show, I know, but what is your text editor and scripting language of choice if you have one? Are you a scripter? Are you a text editing guy?
I'm not a scripter. So it's an irony and a joke in a way that I was almost from the start the oldest and least technical editor at Linux Journal, and I was brought in to cover business, and basically where business and Linux and then later open source overlapped, and so I'm kind of like the Rick Steves of open source, the guy who goes from one country to another without ever quite speaking the language. The only code I know is Morse. I'm old enough, so I really came from the ham radio world, into tech. I mean, I know enough to make trouble. So, but when I started with Linux Journal, it was a decree that we had to use VI. So my text editor has to the degree that I use it often is VI, not Emacs, and I fully respect the decree. I was thinking as Chris was talking that I'd almost like to put a kind of thermometer on the degree of passion people have about one or the other. Like for example, Linus hates Emacs. I mean, he goes out of his way to say he hates Emacs and loves VI or Vim, depending on your generation there. But that was like a decree when I started at Linux Journal. It was like, you're going to use VI. That's it. So that has sort of remained, my standby since then.
Fascinating. In fact, even the editor, I know that I won't call her out by name, but she used VI. I mean, that was the text editor of choice. Thankfully, that was my experience. And Vim. I'll admit, I use arrow keys, so I'm a Vim user. But it's funny. So in other jobs that I've had to use various other editors, online editors, even Microsoft Word, gasp. But it's funny, if you look at a lot of the documents that I write and save, every once in a while you'll see on the bottom :WQ on the bottom of like a Word document,
just because
my brain just automatically I'm done.
Yeah, just punch out. It's like that. I wish I could have gotten into a full habit on it, but there it is. So do you have any plugs, Shawn?
I've been starting my YouTube channel up here again. The last time I really posted stuff to YouTube was like 12 years ago, in the height of Linux Journal stuff. A lot of it was on the Linux Journal Online channel, but I thought it would be fun to start doing that. So my YouTube channel, like and subscribe and click or whatever all the things I'm supposed to say. I'm not really good at YouTube, so but that's what I've been doing.
I may be wrong about this, but I think are all of the things you did for Linux Journal still up there? All of the video type things, which is amazing and good.
I don't. I know that Linux Journal was recently purchased, but I assume that they have that channel. Yeah. I'm not sure if they do or not, though. But it's Linux Journal Online is all the old. I think we could say it because it says
it on the site that Slashdot has it. They at least have the legacy site, and I want to put props into them. I've not talked to anybody there. It happened in the dark when I didn't know anything about it, but I also want to thank London Trust Media and for having saved Linux Journal a year and a half ago, or whenever it was, late 2017, something like that. And I'm hugely appreciative of that. And they kept it going for a year and a half or something like that, and that they kept it up. I mean, so many companies when a publication ceases, it just disappears. Upside did that. I wrote stuff in Upside that has gone to God. It's not in the Internet Archive. It's not anywhere. And
that hurts.
Yeah, that hurts. And there are others like that. The old Fast Company it's still there, but the original stuff isn't there either. The Red something, that was another one. Anyway, but hats off to Slashdot for keeping the archive going. It's just fantastic that it's I don't know if it's permanent. Is anything permanent? The internet is one big whiteboard. Or at least,
although this one is in archive.org, so
it is in archive.org. The whole thing is there, but having it having all those original URLs, not 404, and they go back to 1994. It's amazing. Linux Journal came out with Linux 1.0. So, anyway, it's been great. I have to go do some other things now with the show. Maybe even fixing an ad that I stomped all over and practiced.
Well, I appreciated that because I was able to replace the batteries in my keyboard while you were working on that ad because all of a sudden my keyboard died. I couldn't type in our chat.
Fairly silent. I have a silent keyboard here with the I and the O have disappeared. The J has disappeared. Some other things have worn out.
Right. If you just pick off all the keys, it's not silent. It's just called broken at that point.
I know. Yeah.
All right. Well, hey, thank you for having me as a co-host again, Doc. It's always a pleasure. And I don't know if Chris is watching, but I appreciate him coming on the show and talking
thanks, Chris, for that
nerdy talk with us. All right. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Okay. Thanks, everybody. This has been Floss Weekly. And next week, I don't have up who we're going to have next week, but it'll be good. I promise you that. Thanks a lot for being with us.
Want more TWiT? Check out Tech News Weekly, twit.tv/TNW. Tech News Weekly is a show where Jason Howell and I bring the latest and greatest interviews to you from the people making and breaking the tech news. twit.tv/TNW.